Welcome back, everyone. We're going to give a couple of seconds here for everybody to get joined. While we're waiting, big shout out to our participating partners, sponsors, as it were. Lodo Cloud, Geico, NetSource One, Nutanix, Ampere, Shape Blue, who I'm joined by today in the cube. We'll get started here in just a minute. All right, so welcome everybody to the second day of our virtual summit. Today, we will be going over the global cloud landscape. So super hot topic over the last year, unless you've been living under a rock or just started your IT journey. And I'm joined today by Mr. Giles Sirett. So he is CEO and founder of Shape Blue. And for those of you that don't know, Shape Blue is the largest independent integrator of cloud stack technologies globally. Specifically, we're going to be talking about enterprise infrastructure and how kind of that whole world is responding to a lot of the shakeup that's occurring right now in the wake of kind of traditional legacy platforms and changes to licensing and billing models. We're going to go through, kind of walk through the past, the disruption that has been occurring over the last year, and then what the future might hold from consolidation to open source and everything in between. So I'm going to go ahead and unshare our slide here so that Mr. Giles is the focal point. All right.
So it's a PowerPoint free zone today, right?
PowerPoint free zone. Yes. Everybody's seen plenty of that. So we're going to do just a chat on camera. So why don't we start with kind of the foundation, which is, in my experience, the era where VMware and few other platforms were kind of the undisputed default go-to king of virtualization, right? You've heard, nobody got fired for buying VMware or using VMware, right? So it kind of defined how most enterprises built and scaled their infrastructure during this era. So for that decade or so, where VMware was kind of the default choice, what do you think made it such a dominant force in the space?
Yeah, I mean, 2 decades, really, isn't it? I mean, they've been dominant since I've worked in the industry, and I was sort of there as virtualization came along as a concept. Because unfortunately, I'm a little bit older than you, Daven, but and all these emerging players came out. I think what VMware did really well. I mean, at the heart of any virtualization offering, there's a hypervisor, right? And theirs was good. There were other notable hypervisors around at the time that looked promising, but I think what VMware did was all the pieces around the edge in terms of being a solid vendor, right? The tooling they created around the virtualization platforms, the ecosystem they created, the vendor relationships, integration points they created, the education, the partners, the certification. They were just really a really solid vendor, could be trusted. And it is nearly 20 years. Virtualization has been boring, right? Because nobody got fired for buying. You bought VMware, right?
Yeah.
It's certainly got, there's been lots of different sort of things intertwining with enterprise virtualization, but really at the heart of it, VMware have owned that space. So yeah, I think just doing things right, doing things the way a vendor should behave. Obviously, we may well talk about what's happened in the last 18 months, but up to 18 months ago, yeah, I'd be buying VMware. And we at Shape Blue, we work with Apache Cloud Stack, which is hypervisor agnostic. So part of our job here has been for some time advising customers what virtualization, what hypervisor to choose behind Apache Cloud Stack. So we've seen this sort of situation develop. And by the way, until 18 months ago, VMware was up there not necessarily top of our list, because a lot of the tooling and things they needed weren't necessarily required for a lot of our customers when they're running Cloud Stack as well. But it was certainly, in amongst the top players.
Yeah. And how do you think that kind of dominance in the space, right? Like we're talking about, they were kind of the go-to. How do you think that shaped cloud strategies for the last 10, 15, 20 years, right? Because they were so dominant, because it was kind of the, I don't know, easy button, right? It was kind of the default.
Yeah.
What do you think that did to people designing apps for the last 20 years, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think, it being such a set in stone piece of people's stack, right? The enterprise virtualization piece. I think it almost polarized. You ask about cloud strategies. It polarized cloud strategies because people saw their enterprise virtualization in their own data centers, and they saw cloud as two sort of separate strategies, right? Obviously people would combine those, but you would see organizations sort of flip-flopping between a cloud first and our own data centers first, which would be using VMware. So I think it almost did sort of push those two things apart as two separate streams in a lot of enterprises. And one thing I'm seeing, in the last 18 months is a lot of people are now starting to think about these streams coming back together, right?
Yeah.
So, you've got all these different things. You've got our own in-house virtualization, but do we need to orchestrate and automate on top of that and do self-service for our developers? Yes, we do. Do we want to push some stuff out of our own data centers, but we're also anxious about, what's going on with the hyperscalers, because, the hyperscalers are getting crazily expensive for a lot of people. Yeah, but so let's start to look at this more, in a more joined up way. And I think we're going to certainly see that change over the next couple of years, because the market is now unsettled.
Yeah.
Virtualization is in play once again. It's now an agenda item on many CTO meetings, right?
Yeah. Well, in addition to the polarization of kind of private cloud, public cloud, you also have all of the security stuff that seems to have come out of the woodworks in the last 20 years, I guess. So maybe not woodworks. It feels fast having worked in the industry so much, right? Because you've got the
Yeah,
security implications of public cloud or private cloud, or a cloud with a vendor versus on-prem. And it really seems like a lot of the AI automation stuff is kind of bubbling that stuff back up, right? So you've got all this
yeah,
talk about sovereignty and where your data is at and being more in control of that data. I think we're starting to I think it goes apart and it comes together, like you said, and it goes apart. It like breeds, right? In terms
yeah.
of public cloud, private cloud, open source, paid types of solutions. So it's interesting to see how every buzz phrase, buzzword, the new hot new industry thing causes that breathing to continue, basically.
Yeah, that's right. And you end up, you basically get a sort of Venn diagram, right? I mean, we can never find a Gartner quadrant which matches what we do with Apache Cloud Stack, because we sit in a
Yeah.
number of different and what I'm saying is those quadrants, those Venn diagrams are getting more overlapped now. And I think removing the absolute dominance of one vendor from a foundational part of that, ultimately probably long term is a good thing.
Yeah. No, yeah, totally agree. So you hit on it already, and next I want to kind of move into the present slash last year or so, right? So obviously there's a lot of disruption, changing licensing models, elephant in the room type of stuff, right? So let's talk about kind of that disruption that happened a year or so ago and is still happening, and kind of some of the immediate ripple effects that you've seen across the pond, as it were. So when the acquisition happened, when it was first announced, what was the initial reaction that you saw anyway across your user base in the virtualization environment, globally?
Yeah, so I suppose it started really before the acquisition was, because we all knew about this acquisition a long time before it completed and was officially announced. And what we did start to see is quite a number of organizations looking to layer in, because we work with CloudStack, right? That's the view of the world we get, but looking to layer something in on top of VMware to abstract their automation and their tooling from the VMware API as a sort of safety net, right? Just in case something bad happens. Although I think most people at that stage were thinking nothing's going to dramatically change here. I think some smart organizations, they looked at the history of what Broadcom had done with CA and Semantic, etc., and sort of predicted this. And actually, we've got some of our major customers are people who have predicted it and got ahead of the curve. And then the announcement happened, and nothing really changed, right? For about 72 hours.
Yeah.
One of the interesting insights we've got is a lot of our customers are actually service providers. Right? Openly declare here, US Signal are a customer of ours. We partner with you on Open Cloud. Yep. We started getting calls from service providers who had built their entire offering based on the VMware stack and going, help quickly. So the first big impact we saw was in that space as opposed to the enterprise space. And that was simply about, ripping up an existing partner agreement that lots of organizations, thousands of organizations around the world had for years, and saying, basically indicating this isn't going to be there going forward. And we now know that it's not, but at that time it was introducing uncertainty. So we saw an initial absolute panic around that. I work with open source technology, and I've been going out and talking to people like service providers for years saying, if you're building a market offering based on an orchestrator or a hypervisor platform, you need to do it on open source, right? You can't be, at the mercy of a vendor's roadmap going in a crazy technical direction that doesn't suit your business. Or if you want, you need to control your own destiny. What I never foresaw was a vendor, having such a massive commercial change, right? Well, that was the first wave, and then, to be frank, on the enterprise side, which traditionally is made up about 50% of our customer base, that's come in waves, and that comes in waves when people are sitting down and meeting with their existing supplier. We all know who that is, and they're talking about their renewal price, and there is a lot of organizations who have been sort of hoping and crossing their fingers and burying their head in the sand and saying, okay, I think this will be fine. There might be a bit of a price increase, price hike, but nothing major. And then walking out of that meeting and going, right, we need a different strategy here quickly. And this has been a constant in these organizations for 10, 20 years, right? This is a lot of change very, very quickly for a lot of those organizations.
Yeah, nope, that makes sense. So you kind of hit on it already, and I think your answer may be similar to what you've already stated, but what has the shift this year told you, or maybe everybody else, about vendor lock-in and how fragile it is to depend on a single platform like this?
Yeah, it's the lesson that every CTO and CIO has learned, right? In the last 18 months, I have been there preaching open source and that's very much from the service provider background. I understand enterprise wants the easily adoptable thing, the most commonly used thing, access to skills, training, other vendors, integrations. I get that. But I've been preaching, look, hold on, what if something crazy happened at that vendor? I'd never anticipated something like this. And I think, vendor lock-in and the ability of people to get themselves out of a vendor technology has got to be up there now on every RFP that goes out. It's a massive business risk for organizations. Just thinking back, in years I've been running businesses and we have business continuity plans and things. We never had this as a risk, right? We never had a risk that a core infrastructure vendor at the heart of our stuff would completely rip up their commercial model and make it almost impossible for us to continue buying their tech. And I think that now needs to go in terms of vendor selection. How locked into these people are we? What happens if something changes? And I think you know, if I was now going out and buying infrastructure, whether that's from a service provider or I'm buying my own tin, I would be having that conversation almost in like the first meeting with a vendor is right. Well, tell me what happens if you're not there tomorrow, right? Tell me what happens if our relationship goes bad, if something happens, you get acquired and something crazy happens. And I want those people who I would expect to be sort of partner vendors with me, I want them to be having a very open playbook, if you like, about how somebody can pull themselves out of their services, because that would be right up there on top of my selection criteria.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So we talked a little bit about scramble versus strategy, right? So you said a lot of enterprises you're seeing kind of come in waves as the renewal stuff comes up, which makes sense. Service providers are probably a little bit more strategy or a little bit earlier on. Um, Maybe we explore how the market in general is kind of reacting and what path companies are exploring, right? Because with change comes choices, right? Which is kind of what we're here talking about today. Um, how widespread is the migration away from some of those traditional, more lockdown or vendor locked in products right now, based on what you're seeing?
You mean in terms of to more open solutions?
Yeah, to more open solutions or just different solutions, right? Like what
Yeah.
are I don't know if you can, on the spot wrap any numbers around it, but like what is some of the volume that Shape Blue is seeing, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, if you roll back 2 years, our pipeline was roughly 50% enterprises, 50% service providers, because cloud stack as a technology has been traditionally used, because it's multi-tenant, traditionally used by service providers. Our pipeline is now 95% enterprise. And these are people, these are organizations, they're banks, they're supermarkets, they're payment providers, they're massive telcos who would have no interest in open source technology traditionally.
Yeah,
Right? They would be the people who would be scared of getting fired for not buying whatever was the dominant vendor at the time,
sure.
who are now ripping up their enterprise virtualization strategy. But I think the other thing that's interesting, David, I mean, obviously, we only see the people when they come to us and they say they're
Sure.
interested in working with Apache Cloud Stack and what have you. So it's hard to extrapolate out of what we see, percentages. I think Forrester had it at like they predict 20% of people who were running VMware in the enterprise will migrate. But what we're seeing is if that's 20% is the baseline who end up doing it, we're seeing, I guess, a lot more people are now thinking about it, right? Whether they move now or not, uh, you know, they might have another few years, they might stay with VMware long term, but it's certainly a conversation. It's something that's in play.
Yeah.
But when people come to us, it's then quite interesting because I almost put them into two camps, right? So you've got the people who basically their CIO has said or their CTO has said, right, we need to change this layer in our stack. We need to also go and find something that's open source that which ticks the box in terms of de-risking another event like this, because there's
Yeah.
no point working with one proprietary vendor who's let you down to then go and work with another one who potentially could let you down.
Yep.
We see them falling into two camps. The people who just want to really just change everything from vendor A to vendor B and everything to still be the same, right? But their CIO has said it's got to be open source. And then we see about another 50% who basically are stepping back a little bit and saying, right, no, hold on. This is a time to really think about our compute, our storage, our landscape, our relationship with public cloud, what we're doing in-house, and think about this afresh. So, let's not just look at this as we need to replace a vendor thing. Let's look about this how we're doing globally. So we're working on a lot of projects that are, you know, hybrid, multi-cloud, people
Yeah.
consolidating. At the same time, for the last 3 or 4 years, there has been a movement towards, repatriation out of the big public hyperscalers because their margins are crazy, right? Their margins are so high, and everybody gets hooked on the cheap drug that is one of the three hyperscalers when you start, but then you realize you've got a bad habit in 5 years' time, and it's costing you millions of dollars a month to run your infrastructure, and you could probably run it for a quarter of that, right? So
Yeah.
you see all these things coming together. So yeah, a lot of people, some who are just looking for a sort of lift and shift replacement, and there's certain vendors there fill that gap very well, right?
Yeah.
And then others who are looking to say, okay, let's do something a bit different here. Let's have a different mindset and look at things more globally.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And right, I mean that's where the scrambler strategy comes in, right? In my mind, right? The A to B, move everything over, feels like more of a scramble than a strategy, right? I think the what I would advise and what I think you're advising is a much more detailed look from a individual workload, individual app, or at least a function standpoint, and saying, where does this run optimally, both from a cost standpoint, but also from a technical standpoint, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And as well, I mean, not just on the tech side, but on the organizational side as well, right?
Yeah.
VMware are a really strong vendor and have got a really lovely smooth wrapper around their tech into all those things I talked about earlier in terms of education, in terms of partner organizations and that sort of thing. Going into a more open environment with something like CloudStack, for example, lets you take control of your own destiny and removes that risk, but you're removing that wrapper, right? You're removing the wrapper of, I could just throw this at a vendor, write the check, and that was that taken care of. You've got to think about it more, right? So if you want to 100% make sure you're self-sufficient and not rely on any external parties, you've got some reskilling to do there, right?
Yeah.
If you think your architecture is going to stay exactly the same because you've built it around one vendor's technology and they had offering A, B, C, D, and E, you're now moving to something with slightly different offerings. You might have to rethink that architecture a bit. One thing it would be interesting to ask all these people we're talking to about moving to a different virtualization technology was, if we ask them, what would you really, really like to do? And I bet most of them would sort of say, just not have to do anything really. But the CTO said we've got to because we can't afford. Because actually these are big change projects, right? They're big cultural change, technology changes. And, realistically, that's a hell of a lot of work for companies to do.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And it's a lot of work, and it's time intensive, right? And speaking of options, and there is an option to do nothing. I would never advise that option because I think it's going to get worse, not better. I think you'd probably
Agreed.
agree with me with that. But that is an option, right? So
Yeah.
it being the de facto standard for so long, right? I don't feel like you nearly have as many engineers that specialize it anymore. And I see this, I run our engineering teams here at US Signal. You see it all over the place, right? Because it has been the standard. Like, you go to try to hire a systems engineer, they probably have that
Mm.
experience, right?
Mm.
They don't necessarily have all different forms of experience in Linux, right? All the time, right? Which is
Agreed.
where a lot of the open source stuff is going. So definitely see that on the service provider side, and assuming that we're seeing it a lot on the enterprise side as well. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think enterprise IT has got to work a bit harder for its money, right? It's the idea of just buying components from different vendors, because this is the other thing with this is the hangover from this isn't just about changes in licensing models, changes in partnership, bigger checks being written. It's a trust thing. It's a risk thing, right? And we've come across organizations who have managed to financially negotiate a pretty good settlement, and things haven't gone 100x or 10x. Some of the scare
yeah,
stories, they haven't gone that crazy, but they basically said, time out now. The trust has gone, because that hasn't happened at the moment. That could happen in the future. So I do think enterprise teams are going to have to work a bit harder for their money. They're going to have a broader skill set. They're going to have to go down the stack a little bit more. if they want the advantages of open systems, which removes this risk, right? You could say, no, I'm happy to carry that risk, and we'll de-risk it another way. I think you'd be crazy to do that. I think you need to be in a situation where every technology you've got, you could have multiple vendors providing you services around that technology. That's the model we use here at Shape Blue, right? We provide services around Apache Cloud Stack, but when we first meet people, we say there's lots of others doing the same thing, right? So we're not a single point of failure. We're not something you have to de-risk, because you can take that technology and work with somebody else around that technology. It's not proprietary, and I think that's the key thing that we will see change over the next few years.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So vendors and platforms, I don't think people have always looked at those the way that you would look at employees, right? Like you never want to be single threaded, right? Like you
Yeah,
never put all your eggs in one basket, right? Like you're not going to go have one engineer that has 20 certs and the rest of the engineers have none, right?
yeah,
It's kind of the same thing though, but people don't think of vendors or platforms the same way, obviously, because they didn't for the last 20 years, right? There
yeah,
are so many eggs in that basket, and the eggs in that basket is what makes it hard to move away, right? To your point earlier, right? Where engineers are like, I would love to do nothing and just pay more money and not move away because it's going to be a lot of work, right?
yeah.
But
No,
I
no.
think that, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's just classic de-risking. We've had let's treat this issue with Broadcom and VMware as a case study, right? Because
Yeah.
the whole world doesn't revolve around the virtualization bit of people's stacks. There's a lot of other stuff that's as important, but treat it as a case study of what can happen, right? And then I
Yep.
think when you're making technology decisions going forward, replace those names with whoever you're speaking to at the time. What would happen if an aggressive acquisition came along and they started shaking up the business model and the license? What would happen, if something terrible happened to that vendor and it collapsed, right?
Yeah.
And to me, all of these things, when you look at all of these risks, not necessarily moving everything to open source, but the key critical things, you've got to have control of your own destiny. You've got to know there's not a single point of failure there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the fear of the amount of work will keep people stagnant and stationary, and you just can't be anymore, right? At the end of the day, moving away from something like that platform is not that difficult, right? There's a lot of fear around it because you've got a lot of engineers that are classically trained in that. But
Yeah,
platforms like CloudStack, other open source solutions, US Signals Open Cloud, hyperscalers, like I think a lot of people get in their head that this is some big, insurmountable amount of work, and it's really
yeah,
just not, right? With the platforms and the options
absolutely.
have come tools and process that has made it a lot easier than it was when I was doing it 10 years ago, right? 15 years
Yeah, yeah,
ago. So
yeah. Yeah,
I
the,
think
the,
that,
the
yeah,
technical migration piece is relatively the easiest piece. The most difficult piece is the cultural change. When you've got entire teams who've worked with a particular vendor's technology and nothing else for 20 years, that's going to take them some getting used to. Ecosystem wise, again, VMware have been very, very good at building this large ecosystem. So now Cloud Stack and lots of other technologies are now massively ramping up on our ecosystems in terms of integration points with backup vendors and things like that, because people are rushing into this space. But yeah, there are, the tech piece of a migration is the easiest bit.
agreed.
I don't want to play it down.
Yeah.
Migrating 20,000 VMs from one environment to another is not a 5-minute job, but that, with good planning and good advice is should be the easiest bit.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. So you've dropped this word a few times and it flows well into kind of the next segment I want to cover with risk, right? So right now we're kind of in a stage of risk and opportunity. So talking about kind of the new ecosystem, the new environment that we're seeing emerge from all of these licensing changes and kind of the cultural effects on directors, CIOs, even engineers of like, hey, we kind of have to change the way that we're doing business, or at least the amount of due diligence we're putting into reviewing platforms and what kind of choices we're going to make for, the data in the customers or the apps that I'm responsible for if I'm running an enterprise. Um, Going from underdog platforms to open source, anything in between, and how enterprises kind of future proof their infrastructure. So what are, I guess, how viable is open source, right? So solutions like KVM, Cloud Stack, obviously, as enterprise grade alternatives. Talk through that a little bit, because we get a lot of questions from customers about like, well, is it secure, right? It's open source, so that means there's no support, right? Talk through a little bit about, maybe this is the shameless plug section of Shape Blue for you, Giles. Talk a little bit about, because I'm sure you guys get that too, right?
Yeah, no, of course we do. Of course we do. And I've spent the last 10 years, Daven, you know, trying to counter that argument, right? We choose this thing because it's shiny, right? And it's enterprise grade. Define what enterprise grade means, right? And okay, it's super stable, it's in widespread use, it's got integration points, it's got stuff around, it's got education around it. There are so many open source platforms that have been at the heart of enterprise IT for, what are you using for a web server enterprise? Oh, okay, we're using Apache, we're using Tomcat, whatever it is you're using. You've been using that for years. Now, that isn't a very big visible part of your stack, but you've been relying on that for years, and you're actually happy to consume that as open source. Cloud Stack has been in production use with some of the world's largest companies for like up to a decade. With some of them, it's super stable, but we still get this question asked all the time, and I think it's maybe lack of imagination sometimes, because a good vendor does wrap this stuff up, right? And you've got lots of reference architectures, you've got all the things you feel you need. But when you distill that down, what do you really need? You need a stable platform. You need to know it's in safe hands. It's got a broad community or a strong vendor behind it. You need to know you've got a strong support partner. And nearly every open source technology has got an ecosystem of commercial players around it. Shape Blue, thank you for the chance to pitch us. We are a commercial player around Apache Cloud Stack, so we provide design services, support services, engineering services for organizations who are thinking of implementing or running Apache Cloud Stack. The key difference is our customers are using open source code, right? They can see the code base, they can inspect the code base. They can fall out with Shape Blue because they don't like us anymore, go to another company who work with Cloud Stack and continue to use the same technology. If Shape Blue wasn't here tomorrow and all those companies weren't here tomorrow, the project still survives, it's still maintained. And one of the things with CloudStack, because it's an Apache project, the governance model on Apache is very strong in not letting vendors or organizations take a project in crazy directions. So it gives that long-term sort of organic stability, right? My prediction is in a decade is even with software vendors who are very singular minded, remove the SaaS vendors, that's a slightly different thing, but anybody who's selling on premise software, it's nearly all going to be open source offering. Red Hat have shown how that model can work in the enterprise for the last 15 years, right? And we're going to see more and more and more of that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You talked about a little bit in a previous question, kind of the learning curve, right? Or
Yeah.
the differences from kind of, if I'm an enterprise player and I buy a packaged or bundled solution, it's nice, it's shiny, it's out of the box, I click and I go, right? How do you equate the learning curve of open source, right? Obviously, you guys know CloudStack especially well, but what does that look like in the real world, right? I want to kind of demystify, or Pat in a previous call yesterday did like a myth busting session, right? But bust this myth for the attendees. Like, are we talking about 10 years of on the job training here, or are we talking about a Shape Blue course or a Linux plus cert and stick time? Like how big is that swing?
Well, step back and first of all, what are we talking about? We're talking about a different hypervisor. Most of our customers now are moving towards KVM, but CloudStack does support VMware. It supports XCP-ng, Zen, lots of other hypervisors. But KVM seems to be marching quite strong there. Now, a lot of historic people from the enterprise have been very Windowsy, Microsofty, and VMware focused. KVM by definition is around Linux, right? So your world is going to be more Linux based. There's a lot more Linux based open source projects than Windows based open source projects. Assuming people can overcome that, and that for anybody experienced in our industry should be able to pick up another operating system, then CloudStack is just a technology that people learn. Now, we run a 2-day boot camp course here at Shape Blue, and that takes normally our sweet spot for that is a standard sort of system engineer, site recovery engineer, that sort of thing. And at the end of it, they know enough to go and deploy CloudStack and run CloudStack. Now, our presentation is not as polished as you'd be used to with a vendor like VMware. We don't offer any golf days to the CTOs here. This is open source, right? But we've never had anybody. We've trained thousands of people through that course over the years. We've never had anybody at the end of it wasn't able to go and deploy their infrastructure the way they want. I think one of the things that takes a little bit of getting used to is, with a traditional vendor relationship, you have your support relationship, or your sales relationship, your support relationship. But if you're using an open source technology, you can have a direct relationship into the development and the technical architecture of that technology. Now, we as a company offer to abstract our customers away from that if they want, because they're not all interested in becoming open source people. But we actually do encourage them to get involved in that community. And that's a really positive thing for the customer. But I think in terms of the learning, which is what your question is, that can be a little bit overpowering to sometimes to people who are new to a technology. I haven't just got this thing of, I'm going on a course, I'm reading some documentation, I'm taking an exam, some certification or something like that. I can actually now talk to the people who are developing this thing. And that's really empowering, but, can be a little bit scary to people sometimes.
Yeah. I feel like it's one of those things, kind of like we were talking about from a migration standpoint, that feels hard, but is not hard, right?
Yeah.
It is the impression that I get.
Well,
So,
I mean, if I can ask, Daven, and this might be a bit cheeky of me to do so, you're the perfect case study, right? I think
yeah,
you were somebody who didn't know much about CloudStack about 3 years ago or something like that. How did you find it?
yeah, 100%. So, I mean, we were going through, and when we saw the writing on the wall, we started looking at a lot of different platforms, some paid, some open source. And honestly, kind of stumbled across it. We'd reviewed OpenStack in the past, and we are a user of open source as a service provider in general. But honestly, it was Googling solutions, right? Probably a lot of what people are doing right now. What can I replace this with? Is kind of how we found it. And from an engineering standpoint, I would totally agree. I think it feels easy, right? I know that probably sounds like a cop out, but in terms of the usability, the UI, if you are somebody who has been doing virtualization on site in a VMware cloud and you hit Nutanix cloud, et cetera, it doesn't feel harder, right? Yes, under the covers, there's a lot more Linux. I grew up in the enterprise, right? So I come from a healthcare vertical. It's a lot of Windows, right? So to your point, that is the biggest difference. We're like, whoa, this is a lot of Linux, right?
Yeah.
Um, but Linux in and of itself is not difficult, right? It's way more powerful, way more flexible. You don't always get the pretty pictures, right? I love the way you guys talk about your training feels open source, right? You're not going to go to a golf game or get a nice dinner afterwards, but you're going to be able to deploy it at the end, right? And that's very much how it feels, right? So one thing that kept going through my head when you were saying that was that open source feels like It's for engineers by engineers, right?
That's
Like
a really good good way of
my
explaining it.
engineers love it, right? Because they
Yeah.
they can go and talk to people in the community and collaborate to people in the community, and you can upvote and downvote and have some real sway on a direction that the project goes in, which I think is super powerful. We're talking about manifesting destiny and all that stuff and not getting locked in. Um, just as a ragtag regular engineer of some enterprise, you don't have more sway or less sway than anybody else, right? So
Mhm.
that has been really cool from a flexibility perspective. But I would entirely demystify the this is hard, right? Like, well, I don't want to go back to school and get a bunch of these certifications. It is not difficult.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Slightly different, right? It's slightly different. It's a bit of change. It's a a more ingrained relationship. But as I said, what we do around CloudStack and every other open source project has got lots of vendors and service providers around it who will run it for you if you want to, right?
Yeah.
Effectively, that's what you guys do with Open Cloud, right? You run Apache CloudStack open source for your customers, and so they don't actually have to think about that, and
Yeah.
that's great.
100%.
That model works, but your customers know that you're not basing it on a technology which might not be here tomorrow because the vendor has pivoted 180 degrees and gone in a completely different direction, right?
Yeah. Well, and yeah, that was the entire goal, right? You talked about it earlier. If you go away, Shape Blue goes away, the community doesn't, right? Like there's no amount of loss that makes it just shrivel up and die, right? Which is what we were looking for as a service provider for something that has the longevity that we were shooting for, right? Like we're
Yeah.
not making 1 year, 2 year decisions, right? And nor should anybody in the enterprise be making 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year term decisions. Wink, wink. You should really be focusing further out than that. So I think that is a big part of um, what we like about something like Cloud Stack and obviously Open Cloud. The open source backing of it is really there. I know we're running up on time. I have so many more questions. I feel like I could talk to Giles for all day, whether anybody's watching or not. But so you mentioned this earlier, and I want to hit on it again because it kind of ties into a bunch of our other talks. Do you think we're moving into an era where multi-platform, multi-cloud interoperability is no longer a nice to have and more of a must have based on anybody that's talking to you, people that you're working with in the community, outside the community, enterprises coming to you, etc.?
And if we're short of time, I'll keep the answer really simple. Yes.
Yeah,
Of course, yes, it is. I mean, it was already, wise, smart people were already asking those questions anyway, in terms of, and we'd seen quite a bit of that on the hyperscale repatriation side, in terms of, what are we going to do if we go all in with one of these services? How can we get out of that? How can we balance, uh, you know, from a cost perspective, from a data perspective, etc. It's just going to get more and more, closer to the top of the list. Interoperability is has got to be everything.
yeah,
The problem is with traditional vendors, they want you to buy all their stuff, right? So they want to sell you this whole suite of things that are very good at interoperating themselves, but not with anybody else's stuff. But I think the market won't tolerate that going forward, and
yeah,
we're already seeing that starting to happen.
yeah. Yeah, the amount of eggs that everybody has is not decreasing, right? The only
Correct.
answer is to have more baskets.
Correct. Correct. And more baskets doesn't have to be more complicated, right? If
No.
it's glued together properly and thought about, absolutely doesn't need to be more complicated. I like that analogy, by the way, Daven. That's very good. I might have to write that one down.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, Giles, thanks for your insights. I know we're running up on time. Obviously, it's clear we're entering kind of a new chapter in infrastructure, a new chapter in virtualization, one that's defined less by centralization and that single basket that we were just talking about, and more choices, more openness, and agility. For everyone that joined us today, I think the takeaway is pretty clear. Diligence around reviewing your compute stack, your virtualization stack, question assumptions, right? Don't assume anything, and plan to be adaptable. Your solution should be flexible. you should be able to adapt quickly, steer away from lock-in, carry as many baskets as you can with as many eggs in those baskets, and make it easy to carry those baskets. So,
Brilliant. Great speaking to you, Daven.
yep, you too, Jaws. Appreciate it. Everybody, make sure you tune back in. So after this, we're coming back in a couple minutes here for our next talk. So make sure you tune in to our journey to Open Cloud, our discussion with NetSource One, which is a customer that's actually using Open Cloud. So look forward to seeing you back.